Well, I think to build on your point, it's because we love BYU. We believe in its mission and its aims and its, divine potential as a consecrated community of learners that we want it to do better. That's why we want it to do better, and we each have a part in that. It's easy to just say BYU should. Well, who's BYU? I'm BYU. You're BYU.
Right.
There's sort of an institutional leadership, but the community of BYU is each of us. How can I do better? That means BYU will be better.
And we're officially recording. Thank you so much, Michalyn Steele, for making it on the podcast, the Wilson Seneca podcast.
Great to be with you, Wilson.
I'm really excited for this episode. Like I mentioned before we started filming, I've really just loved having this podcast, getting to have meaningful conversations with people here in the BYU and Provo community. And I'm especially excited to kind of get your perspective and get a lot out of this conversation.
There's nothing more important right now than meaningful conversation. If people could talk to each other better, we would be in a better position all around.
I agree. So I looked it up online. We are first cousins once removed.
Correct.
That's our official
relationship
to each other.
Your dad is my first cousin.
Yes. And, we both come from a Native American heritage, the Seneca Nation in specific.
Right.
And you lived on that reservation until about 12, correct?
Yes, I was born there, and with some stops at BYU as a little baby, and living in Wymount Terrace with my parents. I grew up there on the reservation. And when I was 12, my mom decided to go to law school at BYU, and our family moved to Orem. And my mom went to law school, and I went to Orem Junior High.
That's awesome. And, I've been lucky enough to go up and visit a couple times growing up, be on the reservation, go to live in the Brandt house, eat dinner with my grandfather, who is your uncle, correct? And, we still go, it feels like every other summer to just kind of enjoy the powwows and just be around the culture again, which has been, a really cool experience, honestly, growing up. And I've been really grateful that, we are able to have land and able to have, people that still live on the reservation and connect with those roots that we have.
Yeah. When I was growing up, my grandmother, your great-grandmother, would sort of look around on the reservation and say, we're not supposed to be here. And she said it a little bit defiantly. And what she meant, what I understood her to mean, was she said, but we're survivors, that the Seneca people would not be pushed west any further. And that it was the purpose and plan of the military might and the cultural forces of the United States to forcibly assimilate the Indian tribes. And she was marveling, and I marveled, that there's a miracle of such a thing as a Seneca person in the 21st century. I mean, she didn't make it to the 21st century, but, in the 1990s, she was looking around and saying, if we weren't supposed to be here, but here we are. And she was proud of that. Yeah.
No, I think it's incredible. And just for the audience to kind of get to know you better, I, did a little bit of research.
Okay.
It's been fun because, most of the people that I've had on the podcast have never been interviewed before. Mm-hmm. So I was able to kind of go back and listen to some of your podcasts and things that you've published, and kind of get to know you better, which, I've kind of loved the whole process for it. So, and you can correct me if I got anything wrong.
Okay.
So you grew up on the reservation in upstate New York, and then you moved to Orem around 12 as your mom attended law school here at BYU. You also attended BYU for your undergraduate and master's in humanities.
I did.
And then you went over to Georgetown for law school.
Mm-hmm. I moved back east after I finished a master's degree here at BYU. I actually lived with your grandpa for a little bit.
Oh, nice.
Before I got a permanent apartment, just to transition there. I was working at the United States Senate, and after a few years, my plan was to go do a PhD, but after a few years of working at the Senate, I realized there's a lot of things that you can do with a law degree to be in the rooms, in the conversations, and where the rooms where it happened, as they say in Hamilton, a law degree can really help. So I decided to go to law school.
Yeah, that's awesome. And in 2011, you came to BYU as a distinguished practitioner in residency.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 2014 became an associate professor. In 2019, achieved the rank of professor. And in 2021, you've been working as an associate dean for research and academic affairs, correct?
I was an associate dean for research and academic affairs. Currently, I'm associate dean for faculty and curriculum. It's just a switch
Gotcha.
of job titles, and
That's
responsibilities.
Awesome. No, I think that's awesome. And kind of where I wanted to start today, just talking about our heritage. I think about my grandfather, Martin Seneca, who, grew up on the reservation, earned a scholarship here to play football at BYU. And your mother is the younger sister, correct?
Yes.
Of Martin. She ended up following him out to BYU.
Mm-hmm.
And they both pursued law and eventually became distinguished alumni of Brigham Young University.
And same with their older sister, Loretta.
Gotcha.
Who also went to law school.
That I didn't know, actually.
Yeah, and also was a distinguished alumni of BYU.
And, I take a lot of pride in that, knowing that, they achieved such amazing feats and the impact that it's had on us. And I just wanted to hear kind of your experience, because you were a lot closer to that. You kind of saw them as they went through school and, had their impact on the world. I wanted to just kind of get your experience and perspective on that.
Yeah, I think a lot about the opportunities that, I'll say, your grandfather's generation, my mother's generation, had open to them because their grandparents joined the church. And when the missionaries went to the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation in western New York in the 1940s, they didn't find very many people to listen to their message, but two of the people that they found to listen to their message were your great-great-grandmothers and my great-grandmothers, Nina Tall Chief, Seneca, and Florence Huff Parker. And those two became kind of the heart of the congregation there on the reservation. They were already adults. They were grandmothers when they joined the church. And eventually our grandmother, your great-grandmother, Norma Seneca, also got baptized when my mom was about 7. And so that meant that Norma's children, Martin and Loretta and Carolyn, my mother and your grandfather, that they grew up in the church, and they had opportunities not just because of the church, but BYU came because of the church, and because they had parents, Martin and Norma, who tremendously valued education. They tremendously valued one another. They were a marvelous couple, really committed to their family, worked hard, dreamed big for their children, and had very high expectations of what their children could do. And that sort of lofty vision that they had for their children, we're all still reaping the benefits of, both in terms of the opportunities that come to us spiritually and the opportunities that come to us educationally. And BYU's been a big part of that.
Yeah, no, 100%, I agree. And I can tell, through, listening to other podcasts and just you sharing just now, that you are very passionate about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And something that I find really impressive is that you decided to serve a mission in Texas, correct?
I did. I served a mission. I was eager to serve a mission. I was here at BYU. I did one semester at BYU Hawaii, and I've had to gather that transcript so many times, and it's like swimming and ukulele.
Yeah.
But I was just one semester there. It was a great experience. I got to know people from a lot of different cultures and countries. But at that time, you had to be 21 if you were a woman to go on a mission, and I put in my papers and went to Texas.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like today in the church, it is a lot more common for women, sisters, to serve missions.
I think there were a lot of women serving missions about the time I was going as well. It felt like a more common thing, but I agree that now, especially that they can go at 19, there's just so many more women taking that opportunity and getting the lessons that can really only be learned while you're a missionary, in sacrifice and leadership and understanding the gospel. One of the things that I take away as a blessing of my mission is we taught a lot of first discussions, and I was the one who got to sit there and be tutored by the Spirit in a first discussion all day long, almost every day. I was lucky because I was Spanish speaking. The people in Houston were very welcoming to us, and so even if they didn't feel like they wanted to progress and make additional commitments to the church, they were certainly open to our message. So we taught a lot, and it was a privilege to have that message reinforced to me as I taught.
Yeah, and what would you say was like the main motivator for deciding to serve a mission at that point in time?
I guess I felt like it was my duty. I felt like that the hymn says, because I have been given much, I too must give, and that so on my dad's side of the family, my dad comes from a family of 12 brothers and sisters, and I think, 4 or 5 of his sisters had served missions. So in that side of the family, it felt like that's what you do.
Yeah.
And I wanted those experiences. I wanted to meet the people that I would meet. One of the things I have come to learn is that we ask each other, where did you serve your mission? But after your mission, you learn that a mission is not a where, but it's a who. And I got to meet some really wonderful people, and those are the experiences that I wanted.
Yeah, no, I think that's spectacular. I kind of wanted to shift just a tiny bit, somewhat along the same line. But upon, like I mentioned before, returning from your mission, you finished up school here at BYU, ended up in Georgetown, and then worked for 6 years in the DC area.
A little more than that, yeah.
How long was it?
Well, when I finished, I lived in DC area for 18 years.
Oh, okay.
And when I graduated law school in 2001, and I left in permanently in 2012, so it was about 12 years of practice.
Okay, gotcha. I wanted to ask, kind of, in that world, the law world, which it will become very obvious I don't have a very extensive knowledge of. How were you able to remain Christ-like and show love towards people while still fighting for things that you are passionate about and think are important?
Well, without totally granting your point that I've been able to maintain all those good qualities, but I've certainly aspired to those qualities, even if I've fallen short. But, at the law school, we talk about how the different roles of the Savior that relate to the law, and we emulate those roles. And one of those titles that the Savior takes for himself is advocate, peacemaker, and that I believe that the profession of the law, you can be an advocate and a peacemaker, a mediator, a healer, a judge, all those kinds of things in the Savior's way, in the Savior's model. It was really easy, the path that I chose. I know that Not everybody gets to sort of feel as righteous about the things they're doing. I first worked at a firm that all of our clients were tribes, and I very much believe in the right of tribes to exercise governing power or sovereignty, and it was easy to advocate for that in the whole panoply of their legal needs, negotiating contracts, lobbying, and litigating on their behalf. I felt like we were on the right side of those issues, and it was easy to feel enthusiastic about what our clients were trying to do. And then I had always had a kind of an interest and passion in civil rights, and I got a chance to go to the Department of Justice, to the Civil Rights Division, and I felt like we were on the right side of those cases too. It was mostly Fair Housing Act, and there were often times when I thought, we were suing people who had discriminated on the basis of race or other prohibited traits. And I just thought you couldn't pay me enough money to be on the other side of this table with, representing people. Yes, they deserve representation, but it wasn't where I wanted to be. I wanted to be advocating for those who had been discriminated against. And then eventually I went to sort of back into Indian law stuff and worked for Assistant Secretary Larry Echohawk and supporting the work that the Obama administration was doing. They really ramped up their engagement with tribes, and it was a real pleasure and honor to be part of that. It was a unique moment in the history of the federal government's relationships with tribes. And so I've been very lucky that the opportunities that have come to me have felt like causes I believed in, and I could use my legal education to further those causes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Could you tell me a little bit about who Larry Echohawk is and kind of what role he played in your life, in life in the law world?
Yeah. So Elder Echohawk, before he became Elder Echohawk, he's now an emeritus general authority, but I became aware of him. He was a politician in Idaho, and after my mom graduated from law school, my dad is from Boise, Idaho, and our family moved up there. I only lived there for 3 years to finish high school, and then I was gone from there, but my parents lived there for a really long time. I became aware that my parents were involved with helping support Larry Echohawk's career of he ran for attorney general and won attorney general of Idaho. I remember hearing him say that he had 3 strikes against him to succeed in politics in Idaho. Especially, he was from eastern Idaho. He was a Native American, he was a Democrat, and he was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that those weren't things that were that popular at the time. But he was elected to be attorney general, and he subsequently ran for governor. He didn't win for governor of Idaho, but he made a really good run at it. And then he came to the law school and taught at BYU Law for a number of years. And I circled back in touch with him when President Obama nominated him to be the Assistant Secretary of Interior for Indian Affairs. At that point, I had about 15 years of experience in D.C., a lot of experience working with tribes and Capitol Hill and things like that. And so he invited me to come be part of his staff when he was confirmed. And so I spent, I don't know what it was, 2 or 3 years working on his staff in the Department of Interior.
And what role did he kind of have? Was he more of like a mentor, or what kind of role did he have in your own growth?
I liked his example. I mean, he was a strong advocate, is a strong advocate for tribes, and he was a different kind of leader. I observed his way of being with the tribes and his way of being in D.C. D.C. is sort of divided between principals and staff, and principals are the senators, the representatives, the people with the titles, and the staff are the worker bees. And usually principals kind of walk in and dominate a room, and they talk a little too loud and things like that. I was very interested to see Assistant Secretary Echohawk approach that job with tremendous humility in working with the tribes. And that gave him a lot of credibility. It was very unusual for a principal in D.C., someone with the title Assistant Secretary, to approach the job from a place of humility. He's sort of a quiet man, and but that had its own power. It just was very unusual for D.C. And he was called to be a member of the Quorum of 70, and so he left the position at the Department of Interior. I was looking for a different opportunity at that time, and ended up at the law school. But certainly there's much to admire in the faithfulness of his life and his commitment to advocating for tribes.
That's great. I wanted to ask, I feel like me and those especially within the BYU community are unaware of, the trials that Native Americans endure, especially in today's day and age. I want to ask what do you feel like are things that we should be more aware of, and what are simple things that we can do to have a more positive impact on Native Americans?
It's a really good question. I think one of the first things that everyone can do is understand some historical context for what you might see or think you perceive about life on a reservation. Yes, there's poverty. There are other intergenerational consequences from the policies of the United States that have disrupted Indian families, those relationships, by taking the children into boarding schools, by prohibiting their traditional practices and religion, by confining tribal peoples to unproductive lands, and outlawing many times their traditional beliefs. The successive negotiation of treaties that, rather than honoring the treaties, once they've taken a little, the United States was back again and again and again to further confine the tribes. And you can draw a pretty clear line from the, I'll say, historical trauma that tribes have experienced and the social outcomes that are sometimes at the isolation, the mental health issues, the substance abuse issues. To the extent those things are overrepresented on Indian tribes, it is not hard to understand how we got there. That is the fruit of a poison tree that was planted and nourished by the United States. And it's, to me, rather a miracle that the tribes, so many of the tribes, have survived so well. They weren't done away. It was, as I said earlier, the plan and purpose of the United States to forcibly assimilate, to eradicate the tribes. Much of the wealth of the United States is derived from resources that were acquired from the tribes, just as much of the wealth was built with the labor of enslaved Africans. And so we're not too far removed from those things, and to see the legacy of those policies playing out today, I think an awareness of that. When I was working for Assistant Secretary Echohawk, one of the problems that I was asked to help respond to was a crisis of youth suicide on reservations, that a kind of cultural homelessness or disconnect from their culture that had resulted from a lot of different factors, a sense of a lack of opportunity, and lack of access to mental health resources. Hopelessness about the future was leading to kind of an epidemic of youth suicide, and the tribes are trying to respond. One of the things they talk about is that to reconnect people to those roots. You know how if a plant doesn't have good deep roots, it won't thrive. Mm-hmm. And they were really asking for their partners, stakeholders like the federal government and state governments and mental health providers, to help re-nourish those roots so that they had a strong sense of identity. One of the things that builds resilience in Native youth is a strong sense of their identity, a connection to that heritage. That helps build resilience. How did those roots get to be malnourished? I was in a meeting on the Navajo Nation where they were talking about how their parents and grandparents had been taken away to boarding schools. That had disrupted the primary family bond between parents and children. Those children were essentially orphaned or institutionalized in ways that caused them to have some bonding disorders, so that subsequently when they had children, they hadn't been particularly well parented, many of them. Many of them had suffered abuse in the boarding schools, and that has consequences for their bonds with their children, and the lack of access to any kind of acknowledgement or mental health services leads it to substance abuse. And they drew for me that very clear line of what we're seeing when we perceive negative consequences or negative social outcomes on the reservations. I think it can be really helpful to understand the context of where that comes from. And when someone comes from the reservation and they're making it at BYU, it's not that they're such an exceptional person, right? They are exceptional. But I like to tell Native kids when I'm talking with them that coming through all of that adversity is your superpower, that you don't survive and thrive in spite of your background as Native Americans. You survive and thrive because of it, because you're the answer to the prayers of your ancestors. You're the fulfillment of their hopes and dreams. And when you come to BYU or you go to college and you equip yourself to develop your gifts and make whatever contributions are yours, whatever walking your path, that's what the ancestors survived and endured all of that for, and without losing your sense of identity or cohesion with the community.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great leeway kind of into my next question, which is, so a few years ago, you were assigned to be on the BYU Equity Committee, correct?
Mm-hmm. Race, equity, and belonging.
Gotcha. And, in my time here, I've seen, the emphasis that BYU has made on belonging. For those that are unaware, the campus is 99% white. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of times the voices of the minorities are not, heard as often as they should be. Mm-hmm. What were some of the biggest takeaways from your time being in that committee, and what can we learn from your experience there?
So the committee was formed in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the kind of swell of feeling about racial inequities that we're enduring in the United States. And our task for the committee was specifically to look at the experience of Black students and figure out how we could do better. And I learned in talking, listening, we did a lot of listening, talking with students, how much, particularly those Black students who are members of the church and who come to BYU hoping to fit in because of that primary identity that the Office of Belonging and the Doctrine of Belonging would have us emphasize, how often they feel othered, how often they feel reduced by their fellow students and not seen as brothers and sisters in Christ. But there's, in part of the conclusion of the report, we said that they suffer a lot of, I guess, discrimination. I can't remember exactly the word. And that most of it's unintentional. Most of it is ignorance, the comments that people make, the presumptions that people make, the way that they feel that people don't want to date them, or people just want to treat them as different, or people want to say things that demonstrate their ignorance, with lack of experience with anybody who's not just like them. That can be really hurtful, and it can make students of color feel really isolated on BYU campus, and that's a failure when that happens, of all of us, all of our community. And that, to me, the doctrine of belonging, where yes, our primary identity is as children of Christ, gives us a greater responsibility to ensure that everyone feels included, and to ensure that everybody has a good experience. They feel not just included, but loved and welcomed with all of their gifts and experiences, and not reduced, and also not compelled to sort of, I don't think the doctrine of belonging means so you don't talk about, or you don't acknowledge that that there are other aspects of our identity. We all have complex identities, and to welcome that diversity. One thing I that comes to my mind often is, in beautifying the earth, the Lord provided for variety, and I think that's true in His children as well. We need to welcome that variety. We need to do better about just plain loving people. Let them be individuals. Let them be part of their different cultures and express that, and not use them to educate us, I guess, is a way that there was a lot of students of color felt a lot of burden, that their job was to help resolve some of the ignorance of their fellow students. That's an extra burden. They just need to study physics or English or whatever they're doing, and they don't need to be the educators. It's fine to learn from one another, but we should be learning from one another. But I observed that they felt a lot of the burden of educating fellow students about these kinds of issues, of how to get along with people who are different from you, was not being met by the university itself, but was being sort of shifted onto the students of color in ways that were unfair, in ways that were hampering their educational opportunities.
Yeah, I completely agree. I consider it a blessing, was being able to grow up on the East Coast, just 30 minutes south of Washington, D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
and, be exposed to so many different people of different backgrounds, different religions, races.
Mm-hmm.
And
weren't you a football player?
I was a football player.
Mm-hmm. I remember hearing about you playing football.
Yep, the glory days.
Yeah.
But I'm so grateful for the experiences that I was able to have back there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what's going on with the fans.
And air blowing. Yeah.
Anyway, hopefully that's not too loud.
Mm-hmm.
But, I credit a lot to the person that I am today, to the experiences that I was able to have, growing up in that kind of environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I do agree. I've seen, a change in the way people interact and live their lives being here at BYU.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
I would say mainly in the way that people communicate.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you mentioned before, it's not that, people here don't love Jesus Christ and want to share that love with others, but they just, and I don't want to take away from, the BYU community and people that come here in general, because I think it is very diverse.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that many people serve missions. There's
Mm-hmm.
people from all over the world, different countries, different states, that bring a very varied, range of experiences to the table.
Mm-hmm.
I think also that a lot of times people simply haven't interacted with, for example, people of color,
Mm-hmm.
And don't know exactly the most appropriate way to go about it, or simply are just ignorant to the way that they're speaking or their actions and how that could be potentially offensive to other people. Where I, feel like because I have been given those experiences am more attuned, not that I'm perfect or haven't slipped up or, whatever it is, but just that because I've been exposed to kind of that other world, that I have been more readily equipped to treat people in a way that is a way that they're hoping to be treated and that is overall more respectful.
Yeah. We call that in legal education, and I think medical education does the same thing, cross-cultural competency. Are you able to navigate, communicate with people from other cultures? And it's not just ethnicity, it's religion, it's age, it's socioeconomic status, it's education. Can you communicate with people who are different, who have different experiences? And your upbringing, where the diversity of experience was celebrated, your background as a Native person was celebrated and honored, and you drew important, I think it's fair to say, important lessons and being proud of that ancestry, rightly so, and drawing strength from it. And it's disappointing when, I think this is what we were talking about a minute ago, when people they don't have the cross-cultural competency. And what we found on the committee was that caused the bulk of the problems. There's always outliers who are just outwardly racist and who are, I think they really fail that principle of the gospel. There's no room for racism in the gospel. No priesthood holder, no member of Relief Society, no young person should be using racist language or intentionally harming anyone on the basis of their race. That is just antithetical to the gospel and to discipleship. And I think there is that at BYU as it is everywhere. I don't think it's as much of a problem. We didn't find it was as much of a problem. It happens, but most of the problem we found came from ignorance and a lack of that cross-cultural competency. And but the wound feels the same to the people who are being mistreated or misunderstood in some way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, I'm walking kind of a fine line kind of with the goal of this podcast, which is both, highlight the good, but talk about, what needs to be improved. And I hope that, the people listening, and you included, feel that, I love BYU and I love being here. And that's kind of why I've felt, the drive to talk about the good and highlight the things that need to be improved because, it means so much to me. And BYU has provided so much to not only me, but my family as a whole. I wanted to ask, whether in relation to specifically race or what we've already talked about, what are things that you feel like BYU does really well, and what is maybe something that you feel like isn't talked about enough here among the students and staff?
Well, I think to build on your point, it's because we love BYU. We believe in its mission and its aims and its, divine potential as a consecrated community of learners that we want it to do better. That's why we want it to do better, and we each have a part in that. It's easy to just say BYU should. Well, who's BYU? I'm BYU, you're BYU.
Right.
There's sort of an institutional leadership, but the community of BYU is each of us. How can I do better? That means BYU will be better. How can I be more welcoming and ensure that I'm reaching out in love to all people? It's the same with, I feel the same way about the United States. Because I love the United States, I would really like us to live up to the ideals that are enshrined in the Constitution and our aspirations. And I would like to do what I can to help us be a more just society. I believe in that goal for BYU and for the United States. And I mean, it's like the primary song, kindness begins with me, equity begins with me. Some people don't like that word, but it is. I see it a lot in the Book of Mormon. I mean it in the Book of Mormon sense, but belonging begins with me. And I do think there can be some institutional improvements, and I think they're working on it in terms of what I was talking about a few minutes ago. How do we not just hope that students become cross-culturally competent while they're here at BYU, because BYU really prepares people to go out and be leaders in the community and leaders in the church across the world. One of the mottos of BYU is for the benefit of the world. And people come through BYU and then they go out and bless the world. I heard Elder Holland say one day that the idea of BYU was we come and the church hopes to get as many people through BYU as possible, have BYU kind of go through them as well, and then go out and bless the rest of the world for the rest of their lives. And so part of being effective in that is helping students get that cross-cultural education, that competence, being intentional about it and not just hoping it happens, and living belonging, not just talking about belonging. So those are some ways that I think we can improve.
No, I think that's spectacular. And believe it or not, we're kind of nearing the end of this podcast. Mm-hmm. Something that I really like to do is at the end of each episode, give the person being interviewed an opportunity to just kind of share anything, whether that's something that we've talked about today, something that you wanted to talk about today and haven't had the opportunity yet, really anything that comes to mind. And I kind of like to leave it more open-ended just to kind of give you the freedom to share whatever.
Well, I guess I would speak directly to you, Wilson, and say, I think you have an appreciation for this, but I would just add my witness to it that you and I are the beneficiaries of blessings that were hard won by people who came before us. All the way back to someone like Lehi, who earned promises for his children. Even further back than that, Joseph, who covenanted with the Lord, and the Lord covenanted with him that his children would be blessed. We're reaping some of those blessings now. The favorable circumstances of our lives aren't just of our own making, but it's interesting throughout the Book of Mormon how much the prophets pray for those who would be preserved. Lehi obtains a promise from the Lord that his children would be preserved, that they would come to know of their covenant. Sometimes I hear in the larger, broader Native American community, people want to sort of reject Christianity by saying that that it's sort of the religion of the conqueror. And so the way that they can sort of be more authentically indigenous, they might say, I've heard them say, is to sort of throw off Christianity, right? And I've heard somebody say, I'm not Christian, I'm Indian, as if those two things are incompatible. One of the things that is our inheritance from those two great-grandmothers who heard the message of the missionaries and accepted it and made covenants with the Lord, and their lives were good and righteous, and that earned blessings for their posterity that you and I continue to enjoy, and through our grandmother and grandfather who were good people, and your grandfather who's a good person, your grandmother, and your parents who've made covenants that continue to bless our lives. I guess I would say, there's something where, I forget, I think it's Mormon who writes toward the end of the Book of Mormon specifically to those who were preserved, the children of Lehi, and he says, know that you're of the house of Israel. Know that the Lord preserved this record for you. And part of what he's saying is, Christianity is not a foreign religion to you. It's your inheritance as an indigenous person. And here the Lord is remembering through all the suffering, he's remembering his covenants, and he's remembering that he promised this land to you, and he's remembering that he has a great destiny for you and for your children. And so, I guess I would just echo that, know that you're a Seneca, and that means something. And it means you come from people who chose the Lord, and we continue to sort of reap the harvest of the seeds they planted.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. I am very blessed. We're both very blessed.
Yes.
And it motivates me even more to, carry on those blessings, be grateful for them, and make sure that, I'm doing my part to provide for, the next generation or whoever it is that follows me, that they can be equal beneficiaries of, those blessings that we received. But yeah, I wanted to thank you so much for this conversation and all your insight, your testimony.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, and we'll end it here.
'Cause.